Hey, it's Bob London. Hope everyone's having a great day. I'm following up on this webinar that I did on behalf of Churn Zero called How to Have More Strategic Customer Conversations. What we found was that there were so many questions from so many attendees that we couldn't get to them all. So I'm going to try and answer some of the other questions we got here. Again, if you want to look at, for context, at the recording of the webinar from a few days ago, go to this URL, which will take you to this landing page, and you can access the on-demand version. One other thing is that Churn Zero has already published a really nice summary of some of the questions that we answered during the webinar. And just go to churnzero.com and search for the Q&A, how to have more strategic customer conversations, and you can get right to it. So here's the first one. These are all excellent questions. Once you get the meeting, why, thank you very much, or sign the client. Do you have a set of questions that would move a cold prospect to a meeting with you? So the answer to that, short answer to that, is not really, because this is not a process that is designed to move people along the prospect pipeline. Again, you're trying to have a strategic customer conversation, operative word, strategic, but also customer. So the idea is to get insights from those who are most familiar with you. Not really for prospects. There are ways to use these strategic questions. I would refer back to the webinar recording that can give you insight into the way your customer is thinking and their big picture problems, priorities, perceptions, the 3Ps that we talked about, that would get them to open up and help you understand how to position your solution in a way that addresses their big picture perspective. How can you ensure to get a decision maker in these meetings? Well, there's no way to ensure anything. But if you want the decision maker in the meeting, then you ask your contact to include the decision maker, or if it's okay to include the decision maker if your contact is in fact not the decision maker. And also make it clear that you have some questions about the business. It's not their experience with your product. That's not what's driving the need for this conversation. It's getting their perspective on their business. And so, again, we talked on the webinar about the T-skill person, the person who has a business appreciation for what's going on in the C-suite or the executive level where the business is headed, and also the vertical domain expertise in the area that relates to your solution. The question, what did you talk about right after our call, is very bold. I agree. I like it, but have you had it go wrong? If so, how do you navigate that? Remember, in the webinar, we talk about customer success being truth seekers. I mean, that's you deal in the reality that exists between the customer's expectations and the reality of your company and the product. So there is really, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, there's no way for it to go wrong, because if you ask what they talked about right after the call ended, then first of all, they'll have an appreciation that you're asking and you really want to know. Second of all, even if it's something negative, which is what I believe you mean by have you ever had it go wrong, it's still good news for you, because it may make your face go red a little bit when you're hearing the criticism or the comments. But you can't solve problems unless you know about them. So the best way is, if someone does give you some negative feedback, is to say, you know what, obviously it's a little tough to hear, but we're here to, that's exactly why I asked the question. I'm so glad that you were candid, and that's exactly the purpose of the question. So let's get into a little bit more about what did you mean when you said this, and then take it from there. Having the high-level strategic conversations are great, but how do you scale back and manage expectations of how far your company is willing to go, customer work versus out-of-the-box standardization for SaaS? So, I mean, I totally understand that. Again, I go back to the positioning of these conversations. I think that if it's positioned correctly, even though you're representing your company, it's almost like you're creating a little bit of separation between you and your company by saying, like, we want to know. Now, we can't say we're going to go do everything that you're talking about, but by us understanding your priorities, perceptions, and problems, it's going to help make us a better company and drive better feature prioritization. And we hope that we can serve your needs. So I hope that doesn't sound like wish-wash, but the reality is your job is not to do whatever the customer says and create for your company to create whatever the customer says to create. Your job is to understand their problems and then internalize that and prioritize that. Everyone lives in the real world, including the customer, lives in the real world where you may not be able to build everything they need when they need it. And I think you have to gently establish that's what these calls are about. When asking what would make you a customer life, what if we can't provide them with those needs? That's okay. Again, no one lives in this sort of panacea, fantasyland, fairy tale world. I know it seems like customers do sometimes. But the reality is, if you ask them what would make them a customer for life, a lot of times when they're thinking, wow, that's a great question, no one's asked me that before, you can say, I don't mean literally necessarily, but figuratively speaking, what does it look like for you to never have to worry about looking for another provider again in our area? So when they start answering, it's in that context of sort of figuratively speaking. It's sort of like a wish list. It doesn't mean that these are their demands, that if you can't meet them, it's the end of the world. So again, it has to do with the positioning of the conversations and the tone and tenor of the conversation. For this style of interview, is there a particular personality trait or experience level that you'd recommend of the interviewer? Yeah, I think in terms of experience level, I really think it should be someone who has enough perspective from a business point of view so that they're not, I hate to pick on new college hires. It's not someone just fresh out of college who is just asking questions and doesn't know how to listen and react, and can't add anything to the conversation or hasn't worked with your company long enough to add anything to the conversation. So they have to have an experience level that's at least a few years on the job, but they really have to be, this goes to the personality trait, as important or more so than experience level is the personality trait of curiosity and empathy. If you've got someone who's a little too assertive and aggressive in their responses, it's going to squash the amount of information you get from those customers. So if they're authentically curious and authentically empathetic, then those are the two personality traits I'd look for the most. Okay, I love this one. At what point in the relationship should you ask these questions? The answer is this. Enough time should have elapsed in the customer-vendor relationship so that they have an opinion of you. You're not asking them, it's not post-sale, right? Where they haven't even been onboarded yet. It's really 6 months in, a year in, when they've had enough experience with you to give their honest perspective and also talk about, remember the questions, what surprised you after in the year following your onboarding or signing the contract? What's something that you need us to get better at? Those kinds of questions they can't answer unless they've worked with you for at least 6 months or a year. What's the best way to handle when a customer throws you a curveball, such as answering a question that was way off from what you were expecting? So I'm assuming the second part of this question is the definition of curveball. Answering a question way off from what you were expecting. So I guess there's a couple things. What I always say is there's no such thing as a tangent in these calls, because if the customer is talking about it and going on about it and seems, to have some passion and heat behind it, that means it's important to them, which means it needs to be important to you. There may not be a direct impact or link between what they're saying and your solution, but don't assume that. Take a step back in your mind and say, well, what are they really saying? What's the next logical step to what they're saying, and the next logical step, and is that something that we can ultimately help them with? And if they go off topic and misunderstand your question, that's still a plus, because they're still talking about things that are important to them. And then when they're done, wait till they're done, you gently come back and say, so let me ask the question a different way. Or you could say, so I might not have asked the question I might not have had the best wording in my question. Let me point you in this direction and ask it again. So I hope these answers to the questions that came up in the webinar that we didn't have time to answer have been helpful to you. Remember, you can always download the Customer Rediscovery Playbook for free at chieflisteningofficers.com or www.customerrediscovery.com. I've had dozens and dozens of downloads from customer success folks just in the last week since the webinar, and I've gotten some very positive feedback on it. That's it. Thanks very much. You can always contact me, Bob at chieflisteningofficers.com, if you have any follow-up questions. Hope you have a great rest of the week.